Welcome back to today is Thursday. So I guess this is our Thursday podcast.
Thursday podcast.
It's not really a podcast because we have video. We've been told over and over again, but we don't care. We're set in our ways. We do whatever we want to do.
All right. What do you say?
So welcome back, Steve Autrey, Paul Thompson. And if we're a little delirious, it's because we've come out of Board of Ordained Ministry meetings and we're we just got a lot going on. But it's a great time to have with you and to take the opportunity to dig into Scripture a little bit. Today we're going to talk about the specifics of Matthew 5, verse 17 through verse 20.
So I get the joy of reading this. Again, this is part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. You can envision Jesus is sitting down, gentle slope, and the people are there facing him, and he's begun to teach. We've been through the Beatitudes, a couple other parables about salt and light. And this would have been such an important connection to the people of his day to talk about the relationship of the law, the prophets, and how Jesus comes to fulfill the law.
Because it's how they understood their Scripture. Yeah. I mean, and again, I can't stress how important it is to remember that Jesus didn't have the New Testament with him.
Yeah, he had no, he's not sitting there looking at a manuscript.
And so the people understood who the God of Israel was and their identity as the chosen people primarily through the first 5 books of the Bible. Mm-hmm. And then they had the works of the prophets and Chronicles, Numbers, all of those, but it was really those first 5 books. And within those first books is contained the law of Moses.
All right, so let's read this passage and we'll reflect on more of that. Jesus says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets." Again, the first 5 books of the Bible, or even the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, all of that. "I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of the letter will pass from the law until it is all accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven." Whew, can you imagine being a scribe or Pharisee and hearing him say that in that context? Man, it's fighting words.
Yeah. And for your righteousness to exceed the scribes and the Pharisees, well, good luck with that.
Yeah. What is a scribe, Steve? Scribe, do you get a sense?
So typically a scribe is someone who writes down stuff, right?
Right.
And it's with somebody who would study the law, work on providing information about the law to people.
So it came out of the development of the synagogue. If you know what a synagogue is kind of like a local church. The temple was the main place where the sacrifices were made, but the synagogues were local places, and especially after the exile, people were separated from the temple, couldn't go there. They had to have a new expression of the faith, and it became centered around the understanding of the law, the writings, and the scribes were the people who took care of the writings. There wasn't a Bible in every corner. It was the scrolls. The scribes both copied the scrolls, they kept the scrolls, and they taught about the scrolls.
And as you can tell, that's how I got through divinity school. I just made up stuff because I really didn't know what a scribe was.
You didn't know all that stuff?
I didn't know all that stuff. I just learned something. Thank you.
Yeah, well, you hang around a little bit. You might learn a few things.
Next.
So, Steve, Jesus says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or prophets. I've come to fulfill." Now, man, we got some work to do here to fulfill the law and the prophets. What does Jesus mean when he says that? Not to abolish, but to fulfill.
I think we have to get back to what was the purpose of the law.
Purpose of the law is to define the relationship between God and people. The purpose of the law was to say, this is the identity of who you are based on relationship with me and with one another. Israel was always considered a peculiar people because these laws identified. One of the main peculiarness of Israel was this whole idea of Sabbath. Mm-hmm. Nobody else in the world took one day out of 7 and said, we're only going to rest, we're only going to live, for these 1 out of day 7 days.
And you see a little bit of reflection of that. I mean, one of the things about Chick-fil-A doesn't open on Sunday, right?
Right.
And that's a horrible business model because you've got all those resources, you've got fixed cost in place with a building, parking lot, electricity, and you're not making any money. And from a business point of view, I'm sure people look at a business model and going, you're going to do what? You're going to close, but yet I don't think it's hurt Chick-fil-A.
Nah.
What they found is people actually like working there because they can count on that day, and it is a reflection of their Christian belief. So
growing up, we kind of thought, having to do stuff on Sunday, not being able to do stuff on Sunday was punishment.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, it's mean. The parents are being mean. God's being mean. But the older you get, you're like, man, I really do appreciate that Sunday afternoon nap. I really do appreciate that sense in which we set aside this day simply to commune with God, to commune with one another.
And that idea of Sabbath is to remind us that not only do we need rest, and that's built into the creation, that everything needs to rest and everything needs to recuperate, but it also reminds us that God can take care of creation perfectly well without us.
And the other part of that is when Jesus comes and talks about Sabbath, he makes this statement. He says, Sabbath was not made for man. Man was not made for Sabbath. Sabbath was made for man. And it's this idea that we can take that law too far. And
the idea was to rest and to recuperate, to worship, to be in God's presence, to be with your family. And that's a beautiful thing. But the Pharisees had taken it to the point where they had it so micromanaged, and that might be the best way to think about a Pharisee as a religious micromanager.
Well, they took a nugget of truth, and they kept building hedges around it, and hedges.
Right.
And so that they wouldn't offend, they would go to extreme lengths so as not to offend the kernel.
Right, and they also added layers that were called the tradition of the elders. So what had happened 400 years ago was as true for them as anything that Moses had written. But I mean, there were crazy things in there, like you couldn't walk but so far on the Sabbath. You couldn't carry money but so many paces on the Sabbath. So the workaround would be to take your purse, walk so far, throw it in the dust, and then pick it up. There are even some
animals that had fallen in ditches couldn't be picked up, but
there's
keep
also
them from getting hurt worse.
There's even ideas that if you were to spit on the Sabbath, you were breaking the law because the spit itself would break the dust apart, and that could be considered plowing. That's some of the craziness that was circulating when Jesus came along. And so Jesus is, again, lens through which he's correcting the vision of God. And he's like, no, I didn't come to tear anything down. I came to show you what it really means. One person I got to know, I think you may be familiar with, I think he may have been at one of your seminary professors, was Merwin Johnson.
Yeah, Dr. Johnson.
And I had a conversation with him, a close personal friend, by the way. Anyway, sorry. I actually had a conversation with Merwin a while back, and he's an Old Testament guy, Old Testament scholar, amazing Presbyterian pastor, amazing intellect. And I asked him about, so what this idea of law? And he's like, the law was never meant to be oppressive. He's like, the law was meant to be a space that was carved out and to provide a way for a sinful people to be in the presence of a holy God. And when you think about the law being that which creates space for people to dwell with God, well, what is Jesus? Jesus is giving people a way to dwell with God.
Children need boundaries. They thrive, actually, with boundaries. That's one of the fascinating things. You let a child just start raving, crazy all the time, and it is not unhealthy. Children, actually, animals, need boundaries. That's the law. But it gave generous boundaries, not tight, restrictive boundaries.
Yeah, and when the law done rightly was supposed to be life-giving, not life-draining.
Right, and that's a beautiful image to think about. And so as we'll pick back up tomorrow and start continue to flesh out this idea of Jesus fulfilling the law, not abolishing it. We'll pick back up on that tomorrow and look forward to that. Thanks so much for today.
Thank you.